Hey everyone, I'm Vince. Today I want to share with you about textual criticism of the New Testament. On my channel, I usually do videos summarizing major ideas or books that you might not know about, but that I think you should know about. And for my next book, I was about to make a video on Bart Ehrman's most influential academic book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. But then I realized that since that book was groundbreaking in the field of New Testament textual criticism, people who don't know much about New Testament textual criticism might appreciate a video on New Testament textual criticism. So that's what I'm doing. By the way, if you like videos like this that try to summarize scholarly ideas and books and make them generally understandable, at least I hope, I invite you to look at my channel and ultimately to subscribe to it. I may not get any money for doing this, but I sure do get a charge out of seeing a new subscriber. It makes it all worth it. And if you're already subscribing, then make sure you like this video. All right, textual criticism. So in case you don't know, we don't have any original manuscripts of any book of the Bible. What we do have is tons of copies. Here's what I mean. Think about how this process might have been done. Like someone would have had to write the gospel or the letter or the original book or whatever it is, and they'd have given it to whomever they wrote it for. Since there's no printing press back then when you wanted to preserve a book, or you just wanted to give a copy of that book to somebody, you would have had to copy it by hand. So someone would have written the original, and then someone would have copied it, and then someone would have made a copy of that, and then someone made a copy of that, and so forth and so on. And of course, as they're copying, they're making mistakes. Mostly these are spelling mistakes, but they're also adding words to the text, and they're taking words from the text. And sometimes, again, these are mistakes, like their eyes just accidentally skip from one line to another and skipping over a line as they're copying. Or they could have like two words that end in the same letters, and so they're just skipping over a line. Sometimes they're just trying to clean up the text, like grammatically. So like I said, we have tons of these copies. We have over 7,800 manuscript copies in all. Some of those are complete books. Most of them are just pieces of the text, and some of them are just really one or two verses long. We have more copies of the books of the New Testament than we have any other ancient book, like much more. And that's important because it helps us to better reconstruct what was probably in the original document. So, the more evidence, the better. The problem is that they're all different. Like no two of these almost 8,000 documents are alike. Most of the time, these differences just amount to very, very small things. But sometimes they amount to very, very big things. And so the job of the textual critic is to figure out when there is a difference between these two texts, which is the closest to the original reading, or which one is the deviation, which one is the variant, which one is the change. There's lots of rules that help us do this, that we have developed over time. First is, this one's just intuitive, textual critics assume that when they do see two manuscripts that are different, the older one has a better chance of being the original reading. Now, that's not always the case. Even though we do have many manuscripts, we only have a small fraction of the copies that have ever been made. So there certainly could be mistakes that crept in very, very early. But generally, you can assume that as time went on, more copies were being made, and that means more mistakes were being made. And there's a greater chance that those mistakes are being copied. So it's a good assumption that a copy that is made closer to the original is more likely to have less mistakes and be closer to the original, right? As an example, I'll point to the last 12 verses in the Gospel of Mark. In some manuscripts of Mark, the text ends after, like, Jesus dies and these women visit the tomb, and then they see that Jesus' body is gone, and the text ends by saying that these women went away scared and they didn't tell anyone. In some manuscripts, however, there are more verses there after this verse, and they talk about how Jesus is seen after his resurrection and things that he says to his disciples. So, which is correct? Is it that the women went away and didn't tell anybody, or that Jesus appeared? Well, as it turns out, with the evidence we don't have any that support this resurrection account that Jesus was seen after the resurrection until around the 4th and 5th centuries. all earlier manuscripts of Mark have this shorter reading. So by this criterion, it's likely the original Gospel of Mark did not have these last 12 verses. But again, this is only one criterion. Just because we don't have an earlier witness of the longer ending doesn't mean that it didn't exist. It just means we don't have it. So just one rule won't really tell us if a verse is authentic or not. A second rule for textual criticism is that the shorter reading is usually preferred. And that makes sense when you think about it. So is it more likely that a scribe added something to explain the text, or that they took a text and took something away from it? For instance, what if there's like a town and a description where that town is, and some manuscripts have that description and some manuscripts don't have that description? Is it more likely that the scribe added a description to the town to let readers know where the town is? Or is it more likely that, while they're copying it, they start to copy the description and they say, oh no, I'm not copying that description. Like, people don't know where this town is, then poo-poo on them. Like, I'm just going to scratch that out. Now again, it's not always the case that the shorter reading is closer to the original. For instance, like I mentioned above, sometimes the reading is shorter because scribes just left words out because their eyes might have drifted. But in cases where textual critics can see that that's not the case, generally the shorter reading is assumed to be closer to the original. And again, we look at these 12 verses in Mark. By this criterion, having 12 verses is definitely longer than not having 12 verses. And so the shorter reading, again, is preferred here. A third rule of textual criticism is that the reading that is hardest to understand is probably closest to the original. And this might seem counterintuitive at first, like you think that, oh, okay, the person who wrote it, like they wrote it, they liked it, surely made sense to them, and then the easier reading would be preferred because that's the one that the original author wanted. However, when you think about it, that's not the case. First, the original author might just not have been as educated as the later scribe. And so there might have been mistakes, possibly just grammar mistakes, but also things were said in such a way that they didn't quite make sense, and the scribe wanted to clean it up. Maybe they just said things that were culturally understood, but the scribe changed it to make them understandable to a wider audience. Think of it like this. A person copying the text is much more likely to take a text that they don't think makes sense and to try to clean it up than to take a text that makes perfect sense and then they're going to try to muddy it up. So for this reason, the harder reading or the more difficult reading is generally preferred over the reading that's easier to understand. So again, let's look at the ending of the Gospel of Mark. And I'm not trying to beat up on the Gospel of Mark here or the ending. I'm just kind of trying to show you how these rules work. Is it more likely that the author originally wrote all about Jesus being seen after his resurrection, and he listed all these things that Jesus said, and the scribe thought, oh, that's no good. Like, we wouldn't want people to know that about the risen Lord, would we? And so the scribe took it out. Or is it more likely that the original gospel ended by saying that the women went away scared and they didn't tell anybody, and the scribe was really dissatisfied with that ending, and so they said, hey, that's not the ending. He did resurrect. He talked to his disciples. Look, I'll show you. And then he added these 12 verses. The women running away scared and not telling anyone is definitely the more difficult reading. So by this criterion, the last 12 verses, again, are probably not authentic. Okay, two more widely regarded rules of textual criticism that I feel kind of go together. The first is that the reading that fits internally with the rest of the text is preferred. Or if the reading doesn't fit, it's not preferred, like you need to get rid of it. So for instance, if it has completely different grammar or different ideas or something like that, or the vocabulary is different, then it's probably not original. And so again, looking at Mark 16, 9 through 20, these verses use different vocabulary than Mark. So they say things that Mark hasn't said before. They do use some of the same vocabulary as Mark, but then they use those words differently than Mark uses them. They are made of sentences written in different style than Mark has. Like Mark has a very distinct style. And they also reintroduce characters that Mark previously introduced. And so it just looks like this was not original to the text. It looks like a different author did this. And so another rule of textual criticism, and I think this is the one I think kind of goes with the last one, is that sometimes not only does a textual variant sound dissimilar to the author of that book, but it also sounds very similar to an author of another book. So for instance, again, these last 12 verses, they don't sound like they came from Mark, but we can figure out where it came from. So we can look at the other Gospels and some things from Acts, and it looks like the scribe just kind of mixed together all these other traditions and added them onto this book. All right, so 5 things I listed for us that are the rules of textual criticism generally agreed upon, and that is, number 1, the older reading is to be preferred. So if mistakes occur, they probably occurred later in the transmission of the documents, and so it's more likely that the older is closer to the original. Number 2, the shorter reading is probably closer to the original. It's preferred, and that's because it's more likely that a scribe added information than that they took information out. The third rule is that the more complicated the reading, the harder the reading, the more difficult it is, that's to be preferred. And so is it more likely that a scribe cleaned up a text or that they muddied up a text? Number 4 is consistency in style is to be preferred rather than inconsistency in style. And number 5, is it similar with other writings? Like, can we figure out where it came from? And if we can, then it's likely not original to that text. There are more of these, but these rules are the ones that are generally agreed upon and used by all textual critics. Sometimes textual critics differ on what criteria they use or which ones they give more importance to, more credence to. For instance, at some point, scholars started noticing that they could divide all these manuscripts that we have into different categories. And so if you ever heard of the Alexandrian text or the Byzantine text or the Western text, that's what this is. That's just broad categories that scholars divided these texts into. By the way, it doesn't really have anything to do with where they come from. It has to do with what they include in them or they don't include in them. And some scholars put a lot of credence into those broad divisions. So Bruce Metzger, for example, and he's, if you've heard the name Bruce Metzger, he's widely considered to be one of the most important New Testament textual critics to live, or at least of our time. Well, he thought these divisions were very important, and so he happened to favor the Alexandrian text. And so if he had a variant that he was trying to figure out if it was closer to the original or if it should be negated, then he went through the criterion above, but he also gave credence to it if it was from the Alexandrian category. So check mark, more evidence. Bart Ehrman, on the other hand, is a famous textual critic, and he was actually a student of Metzger's. In fact, he was his last student. He doesn't seem to place any emphasis on these textual traditions. I hate to say not any, but anyway, he doesn't really consider that. So he tends to look at all the manuscripts as on the same playing field, right? No matter what category they're in. So again, that's just personal preferences of the textual critic. So like I said, different textual critics might have different criteria they use, but all the criteria are the same in the respect that they are all trying to uncover what is the best way to explain the difference or the variant. In fact, here's something interesting. F.J.A. Hort, one of the most influential early textual critics, said that textual criticism was a very negative discipline. Not that people shouldn't do it, but it was negative in the way that it was always looking for the corruption of the text. Like, you really couldn't say this is the original reading. All you could really say is this one is not the original reading. If you're familiar with the philosophy of science, it's something like that. Science can't actually say this is the truth. Like in all categories we have uncovered, this is how the world works. What they can say is that they can say this is not the truth. The world does not work this way. All right, that's a video for another day. But the point is, all of textual criticism really boils down to when we see a difference in the text, what best explains why the change took place, or what is the change? And that is it easier to assume that text A was the original and it changed to text B? Or is it easier to assume that text B was the original and we can somehow figure out how it changed to text A? All right, I think that gives you a really good idea of what textual criticism is and how it's used, why it's important. Now for the good stuff, or at least I don't know. I enjoy it. I think it's the good stuff. For the remainder of the video, I'll give you some textual variants, and you can practice your skills on them. So I'll just give you some variants, and you can and we can talk about those. This one's from Matthew 24:36. Some manuscripts read, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." Some manuscripts, however, read, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but the Father only." So they leave out "nor the Son." So it's excluding this part to say the Son doesn't even know, right? Well, the first thing that might stick out to you is that the reading that excludes "nor the Son" is the shorter reading, and it should be preferred. So check mark in that category. However, the longer reading, the one that says that includes "nor the Son" and indicates that Son doesn't know, it is the oldest reading in this instance, and it's also the most difficult to understand because it signifies that Jesus is limited in knowledge. And as you can imagine, the church did not like that very much, right? They don't want Jesus to have any flaws like that. So there's nothing about the style of the words that make us think that it's an addition. And so, did you get it? Ding, 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 ding. It's probably original. It probably, the original text says the Son doesn't know either. Okay, here's another one. This is from 1 John 5, 7, and 8. This is often called the Johannine comma. At this point in the text, 1 John is saying that Jesus came not just in blood, but he came also in water and spirit, and it says these three bear witness to him on earth. And then this sentence appears in some manuscripts which says, also there are three in heaven that bear witness, and that is the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. Okay, so is that verse original or not? The one that says there's also three in heaven, Father, Word, and Holy Spirit. Well, again, if we start with just the length, we can say the shorter reading is preferred, and the shorter text is the one that doesn't have the verse. And this time, the shorter text is also older. In fact, it's older by far. We don't have any evidence of the verse until the 14th century, so I kind of gave us an easy one here, I think. All right, this text is not so much harder to read without that verse, but it's certainly more orthodox to read with it, meaning the church really likes this one a lot. Like if they were going to preserve something, it would be this verse. If it were authentic, this would be the only place in the Bible that the Trinity is specifically mentioned. And so in that respect, you could say that the harder reading is the one that doesn't have this verse. As far as internal consistencies, the verse doesn't fit. The flow of thought seems to be interrupted by this verse. And so you probably figured it out. Ding, 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 ding. It's widely recognized that this verse was added later to the Bible. It's not found, by the way, in our new modern translations. It is found in the King James Version. But at that time, the King James Version really didn't have as much evidence as we have today. So we can forgive them for that. Here's another for you. This one's in John chapter 5. So Jesus is walking by this pool of Bethsaida, and all these people are suffering infirmities and sitting by the pool. In some manuscripts, there is this verse 4, which says that they were all sitting there because occasionally an angel would stir the waters, and the first one who got in got healed. All right, so which is original? The one with the angel stirring the water or not? Well, again, the shorter reading, the one without the angel, is preferred, so we can start off there. It's actually the older reading, but which one's more difficult? You might be inclined to say that the reading with the angel stirring the water is more difficult because it sounds like, God is playing some sort of game with them, and we don't like that very much. But that's actually not something that an ancient would have thought about. God can do whatever God wants, right? And so who are we to question that? So really the more difficult reading, when you think like an ancient, would be that this reading that doesn't have the explanation of why people are sitting around this pool. The easier reading would be the one that has the inclusion in there that says the reason they're standing around the pool is because of this angel. All right, so style and grammar are both different from the rest of the book, and so ding, 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 this was probably added. That's the last time I'll do that, by the way. All right. Those are ones that I gave you are pretty easy. They're generally agreed upon by all textual critics. But now let me show you some that are a little more ambiguous, meaning scholars disagree on what reading they think is actually closer to the original. One of my favorites is Mark 1:41. This is where Jesus heals a man, and in some manuscripts it says he felt compassion for the man, but in some manuscripts it says that he was angry at the man. So which one is it? Is he compassionate and so he heals this man, or does he heal this man because he got angry at him? Obviously, it's easy to see why felt angry could be the original reading, because a scribe would have wanted to change that, right? It's the more difficult reading. Also, there is some internal evidence to felt angry. Like as a matter of fact, Jesus, when he actually says something to the man, he actually snorts at the man, and that's how that should be translated. So anger is certainly something that could be included in this narrative, and Jesus is more human-like in the Gospel of Mark. And in fact, if you have an NIV Bible, this is what the original reading, this is what they think the original reading is, and that's what is included in their Bible. Bart Ehrman, by the way, agrees with that this is the original reading, so he's a textual critic that agrees with felt angry. However, most of the Bibles we have, and therefore many textual critics, pick the compassion reading simply because of the overwhelming attestation, right? The reading of felt angry is very difficult to find. Like every manuscript we have just about has this felt compassion. Further, the people who choose this one, who like this reading better, they feel like they can explain the felt angry reading by looking at words around this verse and seeing that they're very similar to the words felt angry, and thinking that a scribe might have just got confused. It's worth noting, though, that the felt angry reading, saying that Jesus felt angry at the guy, that can be seen as a little subversive to the church and the Christian attitude towards Jesus. So it's possible that, depending on your feeling toward the church, one could see how you would favor one or another reading just because of your internal thoughts. Okay, one very interesting variant found in 1 Corinthians 14, and this was really going to get to personal preference. This is where Paul tells his congregation that women should not be allowed to speak in church and should wait and ask their husbands at home if there's any questions. If you're a man, you really like these verses. All right, anyway, these verses actually appear in every manuscript that we have, and so that's a very good case for their authenticity. However, they also appear in different places in the manuscripts we have, so they're moved around. Now, there could be a number of reasons for that. It could be that they are authentic, that this is actually what Paul wrote, but then some scribes didn't feel like they sounded right where they were, so they moved them. Of course, that could also be an argument against them. So, right, if they don't sound right where they are, then that suggests that they were added in because now it's the more difficult reading. It could be that they were added in to make the letter more in sync with later thinking. But popular thinking by that time was that women were definitely not equal to men whatsoever. And so it's not difficult to think that Paul might have thought that also, and that Paul said that. As far as vocabulary and style, these verses do have differences from the rest of Paul's writings. But on the other hand, when you have just a handful of writings, how meaningful is it really to say that you use a word here that you haven't used in the other 7 letters, right? So there's a lot of debate over this. As you can imagine, there's a lot of theological concerns. So people who don't want these verses to be authentic, voila, they find them to be inauthentic, right? While people who want them to be there argue for their authenticity. I will say, one reason for arguing against them is because the Jesus movement, including Paul, did seem very inclusive of women in the early church, in the early years of the church, and the church only got more and more exclusive as it developed. In fact, to me, and this is the clincher to me, earlier in the same letter, Paul talks about women praying and prophesying in church. So, to me, these verses don't seem to be internally consistent. I lean towards the not authentic. But again, maybe that's just because of personal theology. This textual variant in 1 Corinthians is a lot like the textual variant of the woman caught in adultery in John 8, 1 through 11. And by that I mean that, like the Corinthians passage, this story moves around. It's found in different places, including some manuscripts it's even found in the Gospel of Luke, not in the Gospel of John. Although, unlike the Corinthians passage, we do have manuscripts without it. So it appears to be a story that traveled around by itself and was probably not authentic to any book. It definitely appears to be non-John in style, and it's especially non the place it's located right now. That is, it breaks up the story around it. So most textual critics would say that it's obviously not authentic to the Gospel of John. However, at the same time, they would also say that the story has all the marks of being original in the oral tradition. And by that they mean a lot of textual critics think this does go back to Jesus. All right, so this is one of those stories that people told and scribes just added it in somewhere. But again, it's interesting. If you want it to date back to Jesus, then poof, there's proof for that, right? If not, then probably that proof is not very convincing to you. And this leads us into probably my least favorite textual variant, and that is Luke 23:34, where on the cross, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." The evidence is actually overwhelming that this is not original to Luke. Textual evidence, internal evidence, the shorter reading evidence, you can clearly see why someone would have wanted to add this rather than take it out evidence. All those things point to it being a later addition to the text. And that's really a shame because I like those verses. But of course, just because it's not original to the Bible does not mean it does not go back to Jesus. So, as you might be able to see by the last few examples, what I'm trying to get across is while textual criticism tries to be very scientific, it still has a lot of personal theology involved in it. Okay, there's obviously a lot more textual variants. Some of the more popular ones I'll deal with in my next video in Ehrman's book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, because he deals with those. This video is just for those who maybe didn't know much about it, or they needed a recap, or they're just really interested in textual criticism. If you like the video, like the video. If you enjoy videos like this, where scholarly ideas or books are summarized for you, hit the subscribe button.